Hello. I want to talk about Ukraine, so I'm going to. Now, to begin here, we need to establish 3 basic facts that need to be agreed on and understood before any of the rest of this video is going to make sense to you. If you disagree with any of these, just stop watching. We live in different realities, and I don't think that we're going to agree on anything. 1. There was no genocide of Russian language speakers or Russian culture in Ukraine. 2. There was also no genocide of Russians in Donetsk or Luhansk, and the people who claim that there was just take the death total from that conflict, attribute it all to Ukraine, even though it includes deaths on both sides, and act like it was all civilians when most of the deaths are combatants. 3. The 2014 Euromaidan protests, regardless of what some people say about them, were absolutely heavily contributed to by many years of US and European Union interference in Ukrainian internal affairs, through the exact same pattern of interference that they are currently engaging in Georgia, for example, by, for example, funding NGOs to push politics and economics that they consider more amenable to their interests. Hence why the US and EU have recently been taking the line that a Georgian law to force NGOs to reveal if they are funded by foreign sources represents a threat to democracy. What it really represents is a threat to their clandestine operations, to the illusion that the groups that they fund are independent rather than agents for their interests. There is also pretty convincing evidence to indicate that the US much more directly interfered in Ukrainian politics, as leaked conversations from their embassy make it pretty clear that they had direct input in choosing which Ukrainian politicians would be a part of the post-Maidan government. So again, if you're going to go to the comments right now and express your anger about the things that I just said, this might not be the video for you, because we simply do not live in the same reality, and if we don't agree on the basic ground facts, we can't have a discussion about this. None of that means that Russia was some sort of victim of all of this, as it's often framed as. Russia simply lost out in a geopolitical conflict to its geopolitical rivals, something that you would kind of expect, as obviously the US and EU are far more powerful than Russia is. Up until this point, you could have reasonably said that Russia was pretty clearly the lesser evil in this situation, because there was far clearer evidence of way more direct, way more pervasive EU and US interference in Ukrainian internal affairs. Russia then invaded parts of eastern Ukraine, Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk. And that is kind of the point where they lose any sort of high ground here. Because if pervasive interference in Ukrainian politics is bad, invading Ukraine is a lot worse. And another fact that I need to establish here before moving on is, please don't pretend that there was some sort of real separatist militias in those places and Russia was just joining up with them. They are puppets of Russia. They exist to press Russian interests, and that is why, later on, it became very clear that it was just an excuse to annex these places into Russia eventually, because Russia literally officially annexed them. So the post-Maidan government in Ukraine obviously sucked. It was your generic IMF neoliberal shock treatment sort of puppet government that the US and EU love to install in their victim countries. And yeah, that sucks really bad. That's a problem for Ukrainians, isn't it? It's a problem for them to fight against. And being invaded by your much bigger neighbor is not really a solution to the problems that Ukrainians were having with that, was it? In fact, I would say that causes them a lot more problems, given that as a result of the invasion, they lost one of their most important port cities, as well as 2 not insignificant regions in the east. Russia, ironically, by doing this to Ukraine, pretty much completely destroyed any chance of regaining any sort of goodwill or support in Ukraine. It was really the geopolitical equivalent of a baby throwing a tantrum, because it lost out in its power struggle with the other geopolitical bloc. For all of the shit that is rightfully thrown at the US and EU, for pretty much just using Ukraine and its people as pawns against Russia, it's not like Russia is much better or better at all, because war is quite a bit worse than having an IMF puppet government. Pro-Russia people and people who like to pretend they're not pro-Russia but nonetheless seem to be, like to bring up, for example, the neo-Nazi militias in Ukraine, which, to be clear, obviously do exist, and the fact that they were ever integrated into the official Ukrainian military structure, and they are still today, is incredibly embarrassing and disgusting. But those militias could only gain prominence due to the conditions that Russia created. Russia started a war, and without that war, there would have been no conflict for those militias to fight in the first place. No way for them to gain popularity through combat. And this denazification bullshit, I mean, it's obviously a joke, Russian society is just as conservative, just as right-wing as Ukrainian society is. Just because they've integrated veneration for Stalin into their nationalism doesn't change that. The Russian invasion in the minds of the neo-Nazis in Ukraine basically proved everything they had ever said. And there's no way that the Russians didn't know that when they did it. I'm sure they knew precisely what they were doing, that attacking Ukraine would spur retaliation and provide great opportunities to extremists given the overall weakness of the Ukrainian state and its military, who they could then later point to as an excuse to do further military action, which is precisely what they ended up doing. Now let's go a bit further in time. Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I thought there was no possible reason they would be dumb enough to invade. A land invasion of a neighboring country that is that big. Obviously, Ukraine has a lower population and it's smaller than Russian land area, but it's still quite a large country. Is an absurdity in this day and age. It is simply something that you don't do. Look at the Iran-Iraq war for a fairly recent example of how disastrous and stupid such an idea is. And the way that the war has happened has really proven what I thought correct. It's an utter disaster, a meat grinder by any reasonable definition of the term. The sort of thing that a government could only possibly subject their victims and even their own people to if they simply don't care about them at all. There's no logical, realpolitik reason behind this. It's literally just a blood sacrifice of principally Ukrainians, but also, because I don't want to frame them as the primary victims here, but still, Russians as well. For no real practical reason, aside from an old dictator attempting to cement himself some sort of legacy before he dies, by taking some land from a much smaller neighboring country, and creating a local propaganda narrative around the glory of this war, while pretty much every single other country in the world is abhorred by it. Russian geopolitical power, Russian security concerns, and whatever other bullshit excuses that people make up to try and justify this invasion are obviously not worth hundreds of thousands of lives and the destruction of half of a country, even if they were somehow valid, which, to be clear, they're not. I don't give a shit about Russian security concerns. I don't give a shit about Russian geopolitical power. Nor could such things possibly justify a war like this. It's absolutely true that the European Union and the US pretty much just use Ukraine and its people as meat to throw at Russia to weaken it, to hurt their geopolitical rival in a struggle for the influence of the countries of Eastern Europe. But then Russia is also on the other side, killing those people. So all that, Russia was provoked by the US and EU shit. Man, it makes about as much sense as claiming that Russian interference in Mexico would validate a US invasion. No, it wouldn't. You know, between a country being coerced into joining NATO through pervasive Western geopolitical interference and an all-out war being waged on it, I'd say, the former is preferable to the latter. Like, Ukraine is an actual place where tens of millions of people live. Did you know that? It's not a sacrificial lamb to be put up on the altar and destroyed in the name of fighting Western geopolitical power. If the basic physical integrity of its people is not a priority to you over that, then I don't think we even live on the same planet, honestly. I also want to address another thing, which is comparisons that are often made between the invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and Gaza, Palestine, other similar situations like it. These situations just really are not comparable at all in reality. Ukraine is an actual state that had a real military that was clearly able to competently defend itself against a much larger foe, at least it has been up until now. It looks like eventually they're going to lose the war because Putin is just fine to throw as many Russian bodies in there to gain as much as he can as possible. But Ukraine has nonetheless very competently defended itself. You know, it's an actual state, has actual defined borders, and it's supported by most of the richest and most powerful countries in the world. Palestine, Gaza, is not like that. In fact, it's pretty much completely illegal to support any sort of Palestinian armed resistance. While Ukrainians openly run ads where you can just send them a donation through PayPal or something, it's the most normal thing in the world. All of the countries that are backing Ukraine against Russia also back Israel in its genocide of the Palestinian people. And that's also why it's so easy for so many liberals to support Ukraine and why they're so excited about supporting it. It's like Russia's invasion of Ukraine was the best thing to ever happen to them. Because it allows them to feel like they're on the right side for once. It allows them to play act as the defiant revolutionaries that they like to imagine themselves as, but which in reality, those they oppose usually are. And if there's one thing that I will never forgive Russia for, it's enabling that. That's clearly way worse than hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians being slaughtered. That was called a joke, by the way. Another thing that differentiates it from Gaza very clearly is the fact that it is a regular military conflict. The vast, vast majority of the deaths in this war are combatants, while the vast majority of the deaths in Gaza are of civilians. So the invasion of Ukraine is more of a war for territory, where there has definitely been a disregard for the welfare of the Ukrainians who are already there, but getting rid of them is not particularly the goal. Whereas in Gaza, getting rid of them is clearly the goal. But I want to note too, that does not make it magically okay. It is still a tragedy that swaths of Ukrainian men, and also even Russian men, are being sent to fight in Ukraine, for many of them against their will. Hundreds of thousands of them are being killed for literally nothing that makes any tangible sense. Unless, of course, you believe idiotic Russian denazification narratives. And even then, even if the Nazis were as prominent as pro-Russia people want us to believe in Ukraine, how exactly would a war where you kill way more people than they could ever imagine killing make sense as a response to that? It doesn't, obviously. It really disgusts me, by the way, when I see people post videos of Ukrainian police arresting people who are dodging the draft there, sending them to the front and stuff like that. And they're like, look at these Ukrainians. They are kidnapping men who don't want to fight and sending them to the front. They really don't care about their own people, blah, 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 blah. And I see that, and all that I can think of is, one, Russia's doing that too. Two, that wouldn't be happening if Russia hadn't invaded. Three, any other country in the world, any other nation state would be doing the same thing in the same situation. What the fuck do you expect? Things that have only happened as reactions to the Russian invasion are painted as if they retroactively justify the invasion. Give me a break. Also, just to be clear here, there is no genocide in Ukraine. I don't even think the Ukrainian government earnestly believes that, though publicly they will say they think there is, because they had an opportunity to make a genocide case before the International Court of Justice, but they didn't actually do one. What they did before the ICJ was a pretty clever thing, actually, where rather than accusing Russia of committing genocide against Ukrainians, they accused Russia of improperly abusing the Genocide Convention by inventing a fake genocide of Russian speakers to justify their invasion. And that's a case that I think they're going to win, because pretty clearly Russia misused the idea of a state's obligation to prevent genocide by inventing a fake genocide and then using that to haphazardly justify a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Nonetheless, it won't have any effect other than a symbolic one. What is happening in Ukraine is, by and large, very sort of old-style imperial military aggression after Russia had a bit of a baby-like tantrum because it lost a geopolitical conflict based around political interference in formal Ukrainian politics with the US and the EU. The vast majority of the conflict has centered around military personnel and military targets, and actions that could potentially be considered genocidal, like the Bucha massacre, for example, or the documented kidnapping of at least dozens, perhaps hundreds of Ukrainian children, would need to be proven to be part of a wider campaign to eliminate the Ukrainian people to be considered legally genocide. Thus far, it really does not seem to be anything like that. It is rather just a sort of 19th century style imperial land grab. The sort of thing that you would not expect a supposed world power like Russia to be engaging in, given how counterproductive it has clearly been for its own prestige and especially for the Russian people. Again, not to frame them as the real victims here, because they are not, the Ukrainians are, but Putin is obviously a dictator, he's obviously unelected, and please don't go citing fake Russian elections at me, give me a break. And he has sent hundreds of thousands of people to a neighboring country to die for no real practical reason. Like, the most practical reason for Russia to have invaded Ukraine was to take Crimea. Crimea was the biggest prize in Ukraine. Hugely important port that Russia really gained from, especially economically. The rest of this military campaign in comparison to that is nonsensical. Completely nonsensical. It is quite literally killing people for nothing, causing mass destruction, mass misery, for no reason aside from the annexation of territory to be able to say this territory is Russian instead of Ukrainian. It is a terrible situation, an illogical situation, and an incredibly sad one that I really don't think there is any good answer to presently. I sadly do not see Ukraine being able to come out of this. Bar someone like killing Putin, I don't know how the Ukrainians can win. They are being ground down by an opponent that does not give a single shit about the troops they're sending there, and they simply don't have the manpower to deal with it. Nonetheless, I think this situation has revealed a lot about Western hypocrisy, especially given that it is concurrent with the Gaza genocide. Seeing liberals froth at the mouth to send every sort of weapon to Ukraine, with total disregard for Russia's potential to retaliate disproportionately, including perhaps with nuclear weapons, while they condemn any resistance to Western imperialism anywhere else, also lays very bare what it's all about for them. just supporting the West, no matter what it does, anywhere that it does it. That the West is shipping tons of military hardware to Ukraine, while also shipping tons of military hardware to Israel, reveals plainly the completely cynical and self-serving nature of their geopolitics. Of course, it was already plain to see beforehand, but perhaps more people have seen it now. They really could not make it more obvious. And lastly, it's just very uncomfortable how comfortable some people on the left are with making fun of Ukraine, with making fun of, like, Zelensky, for example. Like, yeah, okay, he's a dumbass. He's someone who was just kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time. Look at him in the Panama Papers. He's clearly not the greatest patriot in the world. But, well, he also happened to be the head of government of a country when it was invaded by a far bigger neighbor for no good reason whatsoever. And that alone makes him 1,000 times the person who Vladimir Putin will ever be. All of that said, I do find the fixation over the supposed poor international left response to the invasion of Ukraine to be a bit of a red herring, because the fact of the matter is that the international left really just doesn't have any significant power. Ukraine is supported by all of the world's most powerful countries. You know, what the hell do you want? Kind words? Ukraine has Abrams tanks. They don't need some powerless communist party to say that they're right as well. So yeah, I just wanted to make a short off-the-cuff video about Ukraine to say that I've covered the topic, as none of the last 6 or 7 videos that I've made have even had a script, but they've all gone very well. And this is a topic that I probably never would have gotten around to talking about unless I just made a quick video on it like this. It's probably not, organized in the best way. I probably missed a ton of potential points. I probably am not going to be able to source it in the most ideal way as I would like. But nonetheless, I wanted to cover the topic because it is obviously a very important thing. It is a large-scale war which could have serious consequences for the future of the world, but one which has nonetheless completely laid bare the myth of Russian power which was previously used to justify all kinds of Western imperialism. There used to be, for example, constant articles like scaremongering about the potential for the Russian military to just invade and conquer all of Western Europe in a month. Something which I think has definitively been proven impossible at this point, given that Russia got bogged down in Ukraine alone. Imagine if it tried to invade further east, especially after the attrition that the war in Ukraine has caused it. It's simply not going to be possible. It would be suicidal for them to even try. And well, Putin's kind of old, and who knows what will happen once he's gone. You never really know it. Even worse people might be able to take charge. But hey, at least it would mean some sort of change, because I honestly do not see any other real possibility of the situation changing anytime soon. Anyway, yeah, see ya.